Hey guys, June here, and this video is going to be a guide for one of my new favorite bosses, the Angel of Death. The mechanical complexity of this fight isn't too serious, but it does involve a lot of team coordination, about on the same level as bosses like Yakamaru, and so I wouldn't recommend approaching this as a beginner. Getting started from the absolute basics, there's not much special about gearing up for Angel of Death. You'll pretty much just want your highest damage boosting equipment in every slot. However, she is susceptible to a few things that most bosses aren't, such as weapon poison, and so you'll want to employ as many of those different damage boosts as possible. Most players will stick with overloads, but alternatively you can use standard Supreme Potions alongside a Berserk Blood Essence for the first two phases of the fight. However, you will still want at least one dose of overload for the third phase when she starts to incorporate a stat draining mechanic. Standard team size at Angel of Death is 7 people. 2 of those will be responsible for alternating base tanking Nex herself, and those people should use magic and have the ability to cast debuffs. The DPS should stick with ranged if possible. The extra long duration of the binds on their stun abilities will be important for dealing with the minions, and they'll often want to bring mechanized Chinchompa switches for dealing with the minions as well, which we'll talk about shortly. It can also be helpful for a couple of these individuals to bring intercepts to deal with one particular special attack that we'll talk about later in the video, but that's not absolutely necessary. One more item of note you definitely want to bring with you to this encounter are Dominion Tower Mines. As of the making of this video, they've been temporarily disabled during the Angel of Death encounter, but ModRamen has said that this was because they caused some bugs with Nex's aggression and cause her to attack pillars and things, and when he gets that patched, he'll allow them again. I'll update the video description once those are usable again, so just check down there if you're watching this video for the first time, but once they are available again, you should consider these absolutely essential for this fight. They deal incredible damage to all of the minions, and they really streamline the fight. Nex has 2 primary forms of basic attack. The first is a magic attack that hits all players within a very large area, almost large enough for the entire arena, and the second is a melee attack that's only directed at her primary target but also splashes damage within a 5x5 area. If we take me as the primary tank in this image as an example, anyone within this 5x5 area is going to be hit with that splash melee damage. Anyone who isn't actively tanking Nex should be standing far enough away that they're not taking any of this splash damage, and they can use the deflect for magic prayer. The tank himself will want to stick with the deflect melee prayer, however they are presented with the issue of the fact that Nex does continue to use magic attacks, so ideally you'll want to have the dexterity to do rapid prayer switches back and forth between magic and melee based on the attack animation that you see Nex using. The window of opportunity to swap to deflect magic prayer is very short, but an unprotected magic hit can hit up to about 6,000 damage, and so if you aren't able to do these prayer switches appropriately, you may find yourself eating your way through your supplies very quickly. The plus side to this is Nex's magic attacks do often miss, so even if you make a mistake prayer switching, you won't always get wrecked by it. However, the melee attacks employ the similar mechanic to Beastmaster or Yakamaru, where if a hit rolls a miss, it just deals reduced damage, and so it effectively has 100% accuracy. On top of the damage from these melee hits, Nex has an enrage mechanic almost identical to the one at Beastmaster, with the exception of the fact that freedom does absolutely nothing to reduce your enrage stacks here. Only the melee hits apply enrage stacks, and only the primary target gets an enrage stack, even if there are individuals who get hit with the splash damage from those melee attacks. The only way to clear these enrage stacks is to not be hit with a melee attack for 30 seconds, which is why you have a second base tank to alternate with. Just like at Beastmaster, we get a friendly on-screen notification for the first, 5th, and 10th stacks, which respectively say Nex lets out a slight hiss as she lands a hit on you, Nex starts to lose control with anger, and Nex begins to scream with rage as she hits you. Again, just like at Beastmaster, the 5th stack also comes with a defensive reset and puts everything on a short cooldown. The 10th stack comes with another reset and a much longer cooldown, and if you have 15 stacks, every one of Nex's attacks resets your defenses and puts them on that long cooldown. These enrage stacks also probably have a damage boosting mechanic to Nex's basic attacks like they do at Beastmaster and Yakamaru, however the amount appears to be small enough to be effectively negligible. The existence of this enrage mechanic means it's important for both of the base tanks to pay attention to where they are on the scale of enrage stacks and use their defensive abilities appropriately. For example, you wouldn't want to try and drop your prayer and use resonance knowing that the next attack is going to be that 5th stack, since it's going to cancel your resonance and deal a huge amount of damage since you dropped your prayer. Likewise, you wouldn't want to use an ability like devotion or debilitate knowing that there's an upcoming defensive reset, since it'll have its duration cut off prematurely and you'll lose all of the benefit of using the ability in the first place. If you and your tanking partner can communicate well, you can tank Nex effectively by rotating just using Resonance, Debilitate, and Devotion, maybe adding in Reflect if you also have a defender available to use without ever having to use any of the costly defensive abilities like Barricade. This is important for both minimizing the amount of supplies that you need to use as the base tank, but also contributing as much as possible to the overall DPS of the team and keeping the kills nice and short. This can be most easily achieved through the use of some kind of voice chat software like TeamSpeak, but if you're not going to be using a voice chat software, you can plan ahead to provoke off of each other at certain points in Nex's attack rotation so that both of you know when the aggro change is going to occur. On top of this enrage mechanic, Nex has a second enrage mechanic that appears to work more similarly to Araxor's enrage mechanic in that it increases over time throughout the kill depending on the way players interact with some different special attacks. The damage increase from this effect appears to be relatively small, and so teams in general will just ignore this effect aside from the way that it interacts with the Blood Reaver special, which we'll talk about shortly. The most common way for this enrage to increase is if Nex happens to be standing in the quadrant where the pillar is in its active state, and the person who is base tanking at that time gets an on-screen notification that warns that Nex's strength is increasing by being too near to that pillar and should try to move her if possible. With all that out of the way, let's take a look at Nex's special attack rotation on Phase 1. There are 3 phases total, and Phase 1 occurs everywhere from 3 million HP to 1.8 million HP. The first special attack is indicated when Nex says the elements call to me and begins facing one of the quadrants in the room. She then teleports to the center of the room and separates each of the quadrants with a wall of ice, which deals damage to players who are standing on it when they're raised. Nex then bombards the players standing in the quadrant that she's facing with smoke damage in 3 sets of 3500 typeless damage, which can be reduced with some defensive abilities. If there are no players standing in the quadrant Nex selected, then she gains 20 of the Araxor-style enrage that we talked about earlier, and so usually a team will select one person to stand in the selected quadrant and use an ability like Debilitate to reduce the incoming damage. In the 3 quadrants Nex hasn't selected, a Blood Reaver spawns with 50,000 HP and begins slowly walking towards Nex. This is the first great opportunity to utilize Dominion Mines. Since there's one person in the damaging quadrant, that leaves 2 people for each of the remaining quadrants who can each drop 2 Dominion Mines per minute, which is a total of 40,000 damage on that Blood Reaver, meaning you can take care of the last 10,000 HP with just a couple of basic abilities. If Dominion Mines aren't an option, you can just bind the Blood Reavers to prevent them from ever reaching Nex while you DPS them down. The easiest way to do this is to capitalize on the extra long bind on the ranged stuns, but you could also use things like Ice Barrage or Entangles if necessary. If any of the Reavers are allowed to reach Nex, it both heals her and deals damage to the team corresponding to how much HP the Reaver had remaining, as well as cancelling any player's defensive abilities, which can be a problem for the tank. The last point of note for this special attack is that Nex stops using basic attacks for quite a long period of time while doing this, and so this is a great opportunity to heal back some HP using Soul Split. The only other special attack on this phase occurs when Nex says let the shadows engulf you, and then every player in the arena has shadow bombs, which are ironically red in color, drop on top of them. Nex usually appears to drop 3 bombs in quick succession, but there appear to be some bugs that cause her to occasionally drop fewer than normal. These bombs deal heavy, rapid, typeless damage to anybody left standing on them, but all you need to do to avoid that damage is to move off of them. Keep in mind that these bombs persist for quite a long time, and so some teams have decided to intentionally drop them along each of the barrier lines from the previous special attack so that when the next cycle occurs, the ice actually clears those bombs. Nex will continue to alternate these 2 attacks all the way down to 1.8 million HP with the addition of a minion summon at 2.1 million HP. When she does this, she once again migrates to the center of the arena and calls for aid from her Prysil. Shortly after, a crystal will burst into existence in each of the quadrants, which deals a small amount of typeless damage to any player caught in the blast. Each of these crystals should be killed as quickly as possible as they're charging up to summon the minion. If they're killed before they're fully done charging, the minion is summoned with half as much HP. Dominion Tower Mines do work on these crystals once they're patched back in, but it shouldn't be too difficult to destroy them in time either way. In either case, once the minions are spawned, they're next on the agenda to kill, and they have some interesting fight mechanics, including a full adrenaline bar as well as the ability to use abilities. Adrenaline draining tactics like the Siphon ability or using Natural Instinct work on the minions, and so fighting them can feel very much like PvP. Tanking the minions is quite easy just through the use of things like Devotion and Debilitate, however you should plan ahead for an individual to be the active holder of aggression for each of those minions to prevent them from being on the base tanks. One of the most common strategies for dealing with the minions at this point involves luring them into the center underneath where Nex is to capitalize best on AoE damage. To accomplish this, the tank for each minion should be standing at this location in their respective quadrants. When the minion spawns right around this location, the player just takes 1 step diagonally towards the center and surges across the emblem in the center of the arena. It's quite simple to do, and once the minions are all stacked up, it gives the team a wonderful opportunity for the mages to utilize things like Dragon Breath, Corruption, Blast, and Detonate, and for the rangers to use the Mechanized Chinchampus, which we talked at the beginning of the video, to really rip out some damage against all of them simultaneously. The reason this strategy is so popular is it allows players to focus on Nex while also dealing damage to the minions, because phasing Nex down to 1.8 million HP and changing her special attacks to the rotation from phase 2 makes dealing with the minions much easier. All of these strategies of course should be planned out with your team ahead of time, but it's likely that your team is going to try to do this middle lure strategy so that you can phase Nex down to 1.8 million HP while also dealing with the minions. In any case, it's also important which order the minions die in, because the order that the minions are killed corresponds to which order the pillars become vulnerable in on phase 3, which we'll talk about later in the video. Which pillars are alive on that phase also correspond to which special attacks Nex is able to use during that phase, and so it's common for the team to set things up so that they can eliminate the most dangerous special attacks first, which in this case is to eliminate the southeastern pillar first, which is the Shadow, and then to move counterclockwise from Shadow to Ice to Blood and finally to Smoke. In order for the pillars to become vulnerable in that order, you have to kill the minions in that order, so keep that in mind while you're dealing with them. Also keep in mind that as you're dealing with the minions, Nex is going to continue rotating her special attacks, either the special attacks from Phase 1 or Phase 2 depending on whether you phased her past that HP threshold. So with all that said, let's move on to Phase 2 and take a look at Nex's new special attacks. She surrenders both that she used on Phase 1 and has gained 3 in replacement. The first of these specials comes when Nex says something about letting the smoke flow around you and consume you, and 2 of the players on the team are given an on-screen notification that Nex is channeling power towards them either from the north or from the west. This means Nex is going to drop a line of fire on top of the player, very much like Vindicta's fire attack, either from the northern wall or from the eastern wall. This deals rapid magic damage, so it's obviously important not to drop this on the team, but you can actually prevent these from appearing at all. For instance, the individual who gets the message that it's coming from the north can run to either the western or the eastern wall, and it won't be deployed at all, and the person who gets the message that it's coming from the east can stand along the northern or the southern wall. If you have difficulty keeping track of that, you can just stand in the corner of the arena and that prevents any of the firewalls from spawning. The second special occurs when Nex challenges the players to try to contain the power of smoke, and she fires this strange looking thing with a pillar in the center of it somewhere in the arena. This pillar can be activated, and if done, it splits 14,000 damage between any players standing inside the area. If players don't activate it, after a short time it will split a much higher amount of damage to all players in the arena, as well as canceling defensive abilities, which can be dangerous for the base tank. The last way this special is commonly dealt with is to have 2 designated players on the team who are going to alternate using Barricade and Intercept on the individual who activates it. The defensive cancelling effect of activating the pillar doesn't pass along the Intercept, so all 14,000 damage that would be directed at the individual who is activating the pillar is instead blocked with Barricade. For the second cycle of the special attack, the person who would have activated it the first time is going to instead be the one who's cading and intercepting the person who was cading and intercepting the first time. The last special attack on this phase occurs when Nex says "you stay down," and the player who's targeted gets stunned and gets several on-screen notifications that show them that they're going to be hit by this icicle attack. It's their responsibility at this point to use freedom and move far enough away from other people that when the icicle attack does occur, it doesn't hit any of the other individuals on the team with the AoE damage. Basically, the way this special attack works is the ice crystal itself has life points, and based on how much damage has been dealt to the icicle when the effect wears off, the player who was frozen receives a certain amount of bleed damage. Standing directly adjacent to another player while you have this bleed effect active also increases its damage by 50%, but the problem with this special is the icicle has so much HP that it's just too much damage lost against Nex, and most teams instead expect the person who is iced to simply tank the damage. The total damage is 12k, assuming nobody attacked the icicle and nobody is nearby enough to increase the bleed damage, and so a couple of Rocktail Brews is more than enough to offset the damage from this. Things like Freedom and Numbing Roots cannot be used to clear the bleed, and using things like Protect from Melee or Devotion will not reduce the damage from it. Next, we'll continue to alternate these 3 specials in the same order until she reaches 600,000 life points and the final phase of the fight begins. The only final concern here is you don't want to phase Nex into the final phase knowing that there's an upcoming ice special from phase 2, because if the individual who's getting the ice special happens to be frozen at the time that phase 3 starts and the shadow bombs start flying, that person is effectively dead. With that said, this final phase at Nex is a last stand very much like Yakamaru's Mirage phase, where things tend to get chaotic and dangerous. As soon as the phase begins, Nex becomes completely invulnerable and ceases using her melee attacks altogether, so it's quite easy to use only a single tank at this point. The first of the 4 pillars will become vulnerable, and it's the DPS's job to start killing them as quickly as possible. The primary special attack on this phase is indicated by the player receiving an on-screen message that they were chosen by Nex to receive the full power of the elements. This causes a bar to start charging underneath the player's adrenaline, and they need to be standing inside the center of the arena in the shield dome while that bar charges, or else they'll be instant killed. After the first round it's charged, it charges a second time, and when that's released, it drops a permanent bomb at that player's location in the arena. This bomb will persist for the rest of the fight, and it will rapidly deal 3,000 damage to any player standing on top of it, so it's vitally important to put it somewhere around the outside rim of the arena, far away from anywhere that is going to interfere with the fight. This special attack will continue for the entire phase, and so as the phase goes on and the special happens more and more, smaller and smaller areas of the arena are going to be usable, and depending on how rapidly the team's able to complete the phase, you may find that the entire arena ends up covered with these things. One of the absolute worst things you can do is to remain inside the shield dome in the center of the arena for the second bar fill so that you leave a permanent bomb in the only safe haven that protects the people from the instant kill. Nex also gains a special attack from each of the pillars. The first from the Ice Pillar is that a visual effect will appear on the screen of the player affected, and if not cleared by using the ability Freedom at some point while this is charging up, it will do a freeze and bleed very similar to the special attack from Phase 2. The second special is Shadow Bombs, which are dropped very similarly to the way that they are in the normal Nex fight, but often in rapid succession 5 or 6 at a time, and they can deal upwards of 4,000 typeless damage each. Avoiding these is relatively easy, but it does require you to rapidly move around, and it is possible to accidentally walk on other people's Shadow Bombs and take damage from them. The Blood Pillar special causes Nex to regenerate HP over time, and the Smoke Pillar special drains the stats of players and also seems to reduce the overload timer. As players kill the pillars, she will progressively lose these specials, and so the fight will become progressively easier. It's also possible for the base tank to lure Nex far enough away that players standing on the far corners while dealing with the pillars are able to use Soul Split and heal back some of their HP. Once all 4 pillars have been killed, Nex once again becomes vulnerable, and your team simply has to deal with her remaining 600,000 HP, with the only remaining special attack being that instant kill elements bomb followed by the dropping of the permanent bomb. This final part of the fight is actually remarkably easy, and so any team that made it this far shouldn't have any trouble completing the fight at this point. The only potential problem here would be if someone were to have misplaced one of those elements bombs, which is why it's so vitally important to be strategic about their placement earlier on in the phase. So thank you guys as always for watching. I apologize for how long it took me to get this video made and put out there. I do love making these videos, but IRL stuff has been so crazy recently that I barely even had time to work on videos. Thanks to all of you for your patience in the meantime, and I hope this video lives up to your expectations. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.